All right, guys, welcome to our first real lecture in this course. And so what I want to do here is talk to you about key ideas, big ideas and key concepts in special education. So remember, some of your learning outcomes for this week are to tell me what is special education, what is a disability, what is a handicap, there's a difference. What do we mean by exceptional when we say a child is an exceptional learner or a student with exceptionalities? Well, we're going to kind of parse all that out here. Before we get started, I do want to talk to you about this really important concept in special education, really just in the world of people with disabilities in general, and that's this concept of person-first language. So you say the person before the disability. So you would say the boy with autism, okay? The girl with a learning disability. That's important because you're putting emphasis on the person first. That's what's important, the person. The disability is an ancillary, secondary characteristic of that person. That person is a person first. The disability is just a characteristic of that person. So person-first language, that's the gold standard in which we speak in this field. So go ahead and try to adopt that into your vernacular. So here are some bad examples. You wouldn't say the autistic boy. You wouldn't say the Down syndrome girl, because that's basically labeling someone by their disability, not putting emphasis on the person first. So instead, say the boy with autism or the girl with Down syndrome. Okay, so maybe pause for a second and try to think of some examples of person-first language. Okay, just like with reading, if you feel like you are getting fatigued, you're paying attention to the video and you find yourself wondering, pause, take a break, come back and watch the rest of the video. All right, so what is exceptionality? We're talking about, and this course is an introduction to exceptional children. What do I mean by exceptionality? Now, if you don't know who this guy is, this is Donald Rumsfeld. He was in the George Bush administration. He was the first controversial Donald in politics. So regardless of your politics and your political leanings and ideologies, Rumsfeld once said something that stood out to me, and I think it applies very well to special education and this concept of exceptionality and disabilities. He said there are no knowns, so things that we know, right? And there are known unknowns, so there are things that we know we don't know the answer to. But then there's also unknown unknowns. So in other words, things that we don't even know that we don't know yet. I think that pretty much sums up special education and the world of disabilities. We know so much about how to adequately or effectively teach these kids, but then there's much more to learn. We also know how certain disabilities are caused, but for many disabilities, we don't know how they're caused. But then there are things that we don't even know that we don't know. We haven't even stumbled across that yet. So we know a lot of things in special education about people with disabilities. There's a lot we don't know. There's a lot to still even be unearthed in this field. All right. So let's talk about an educational definition of exceptional learners. So basically, exceptional learners, that's someone who requires some kind of specialized education if they're going to reach their full human potential, okay? So maybe this is someone who struggles with emotional regulation, so a kid with like an emotional behavioral disorder. Cognitive processing, okay, so thinking, IQ. Maybe they have some kind of physical abnormality, or they have a speech impairment. Basically, there's something about this person, a characteristic, that we need to address in education, and we need to be a little more specialized in our approach in order for this person to have full access to the curriculum and to be more likely to meet their human potential. So disabilities, if a person has a disability in one of these areas, it will impede them academically and behaviorally, and basically it's difficult for them to function in these areas due to some inability, and that's what we call a disability. We'll parse that out a little bit more as we go further into this. So that big idea, what is exceptionality? We've kind of hit on that. Basically, someone needs something a little bit more because they have an inability or an impediment in some way. There's some reduced functioning in some area. Well, let's talk about the study of exceptionalities, okay? So special education, anything in the realm of working with people with disabilities, when we study exceptionalities, we're looking at the differences and the similarities among people, okay? So we look at inabilities, things that people can't do because of some limitation in functioning. But then we also look at talents, okay, exceptional talents. In the world of exceptional children, often we think about kids with disabilities, but this really also applies to kids who are gifted and talented because they need some kind of enriched approach in order to meet their full potential, okay? So a kid with exceptional talents, a kid who's gifted and creative, they are also an exceptional learner. Okay. So if we're talking about exceptional, we're talking about someone who differs from the norm in some way. Either they're performing below or they're performing much higher than their peers in some way. Well, why do you think that's problematic? Okay, so maybe pause the video. Think about this for a few seconds. Why would basically comparing kids to other kids be problematic? Well, the question there is, who constitutes normal? How do we set a norm when we're talking about behavior? There's so many influences that impact behavior. Family dynamics, okay? Cultural norms. When it comes to language, academics, the things that we know about, that has to do with environment. So how do we begin to say this is normal? If you perform below this, then you might have a disability. You're struggling. Or if you're above this bar, then you were gifted or talented. That becomes very, very difficult to make that distinction because where do we draw the line to establish normalcy? So there's this ambiguity associated with this term normal in order to identify people who are exceptional. Okay, so we'll play around with that idea a little bit more later on. So how does a kid become eligible for special education? Well, I've given you one definition of exceptional. So someone who requires a little bit extra or some other approach to meet their human potential. Therefore, if we're using that definition, exceptional learners are people who require special ed services in order to reach their potential. So again, I'm talking about kids with disabilities. I'm talking about kids who are gifted and talented. You can consider those programs specialized education or special education. For a kid to be deemed eligible for special education in public schools, they must have a disability that impacts them in academics in some way. So it negatively impacts their academic progress or their academic functioning. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean a kid has to have a disability related to academics, something like dyslexia or, something like an intellectual disability, also known as mental retardation. We'll talk about that in a minute. Those are things that directly correlate to academic performance, but it could be something like an emotional behavior disorder, okay, or ADHD. So distraction or emotional regulation is impeding this kid from having full access to instruction, to learning activities. Therefore, they're falling behind academically. They're being impacted negatively by that disability in some way. So one of the outcomes for this week is to define special education. Well, special education is really teaching that is individualized. It's based on what that student needs, okay? We don't just put a bunch of kids who have disabilities in a small group and, there's 3 or 4 or 5 of them. That's special education. It is individualized. It addresses those idiosyncratic needs of that child. What does that kid need specifically? Where are they limited in functioning? In what area? And we need to hone in on that in a way that we know works for those kinds of kids. Okay, what are we doing differently for that kid based off of their needs? So it's individualized, and we often call that specially designed instruction. So it's not just what the other kids are getting. We're doing something different because that kid has exceptional needs. And it's intensive, okay? That's another part of specially designed instruction, okay? So maybe we're giving this kid extra practice, okay? Maybe, we're teaching them something, but we're using much more visual approaches. We're using memorization strategies. We're using a lot more structured supports, graphic organizers, things that are basically much more intensive than what a typical kid would need to learn a concept. That's what special education is. So when special education works the way it should work, if it's intensive, if it's truly individualized, then the result is there's improved academic achievement and social behavior for that kid. So special education means that, and this comes directly from the law, special education means specially designed instruction that meets the unusual needs or unique needs of an exceptional student. Okay, specially designed. It has to address what that kid needs specifically. Okay, if it's something where they struggle with behavior, if they struggle with cognition, thinking, if it's reading, math specifically, we're honing in on that, and we're using evidence-based practices to address that kid's specific needs. Special education is not just a place, and we often think about it like that, or people often think about it that way, that it's a separate setting, it's a separate classroom. That's not necessarily the case. So there are different forms of special education. It could just be that the kid needs some kind of specialized materials. Maybe you have a kid with a visual impairment. They're totally capable of functioning in a general education classroom. They can access all the content that the general education teacher puts out there. So they can do the work, but they have a visual impairment. Well, maybe this kid just needs some enlarged print, or they need better lighting or better contrast in order to see and access those materials or those learning activities. It could just be specialized teaching techniques within the classroom. And so this is something that, if you have a collaborative classroom where it's a gen ed teacher and a special ed teacher, often, that's occurring in the typical classroom, the special ed teacher is doing something a little more intensive. They're using a different teaching technique for that kid. That may mean that instead of it being an exploration-based approach to learning, that special ed teacher is doing very explicit, guided, direct instruction for that kid. They're walking them through the process of problem solving, basically giving that kid as much support as they can and then fading it back as the kid shows mastery. Whereas a typical kid may not need that much support. It could be special equipment, okay, or a special facility, some kind of place, a building, some kind of supports within the building. Basically, special education is not just a separate classroom. It could be special materials, teaching, or some type of equipment that allows the kid access to the curriculum just like everyone else. And it could be related services. It could be that the kid needs specialized transportation, but they don't need anything else, okay? Maybe they need a speech therapist. Maybe they need an occupational therapist, someone to help them with fine motor, gross motor skills, and that can occur within the context of a general education classroom, or maybe they get that supplementary on the side. So, where are students with disabilities served? I said it's not a place, but we do have to think about where they are served. Well, there is this concept, and you need to know this, called the continuum of placement or the continuum of services. I'd pause and jot that down, continuum of placement or continuum of services. Basically, it looks like this. And it goes from least separate, and when I mean separate, I mean that kid is included with their typically achieving peers to the highest extent possible, all the way up to the most specialized, most separate setting. That's the continuum here. So basically, the least specialized or the least separate setting for a kid is that they're receiving education in the general education classroom with all their same age peers, typically developing peers, with no one else in there, okay? It's just a gen ed teacher, all right? Maybe there's some materials or something like that, some specialized materials that are allowing the kid to be in the classroom with just the gen ed teacher. The next level is what we call with consultation, and this is something that I've done a lot in my career, and it's basically the gen ed teacher is responsible for delivering instruction to this kid with a disability in the general education classroom, but a special ed teacher meets with that gen ed teacher maybe during planning or some specified time outside of class, and they give them guidance on how to work with that kid, okay? So that's kind of how that moves along. You've got co-teaching, where you have the teacher in the classroom, an itinerant teacher is kind of what we're getting at there. So you have a gen ed teacher and a sped teacher in the classroom together, working together for those kids. You have a resource teacher. This means that the kid they have a disability, they're in the gen ed classroom most of the time, but maybe they really, really struggle in math. So for the math class, they go to a smaller group. Maybe they go to a separate classroom just for that class, and they get intensive mathematics instruction from a special education teacher. We call that a resource room. And that's kind of in the middle of this continuum of services, because you're getting a little more restrictive because you're pulling that kid out of the gen ed classroom. A self-contained classroom is basically the kid spends most of their time, 85, 90%, maybe even the whole day, in a separate small classroom. Typically this is for kids with severe, profound intellectual disabilities, maybe some severe orthopedic impairments. Maybe it's a kid with severe behavior issues, aggression, and so they have to be in the self-contained setting temporarily. But basically self-contained means it's in the school, but it's in a separate classroom away from the gen ed kids. Obviously you're getting a lot more specialized with the teachers, you're getting a lot more restrictive with the setting. This can go up to day school, homebound or hospital instruction, or even a residential school. You know, I've seen schools where kids with severe behavior disorders who have suicidal ideations, extreme aggressive behaviors, aggression, so verbally, physically, they basically live at this school. It's a residential school, and that's kind of for their safety as much as the people around them. And so that is very restrictive, obviously, and it requires specialized instruction, specialized expertise from the teachers in that school. So those are the placement options, the settings that we can use for special education. Now, there's this idea of least restrictive environment, and we kind of touched on that with the continuum of services. Least restrictive environment, again, LRE is what we call that for short. That means we're keeping the kid with the general education population as much as possible. Least restrictive environment. But there's this debate that is the general education classroom always the least restrictive environment? Well, we have to think about it as the LRE is where the kid is most likely to succeed. Where are they going to learn best? For some kids, that may or may not be the general education classroom. For most, it is. But for some, maybe not. So there's this logic that the greater restriction of physical environment means the greater restriction of psychological freedom or human potential and rights. And so the more restrictive, the more limited access this kid has to their typically developing peers, are we potentially infringing on their potential and on their rights? Is it an ethical issue that we're running into here? Okay, so that's a hot topic right now. Does it? I don't know. I mean, that's something for you to think about. We can have that conversation when we meet in class next time, but it's something that many people are arguing about right now. And so we can even kind of break this. There's some people who are arguing that maybe we don't need to call this least restrictive environment as much as we need to call this the most enabling environment. So in which environment are these kids most likely to be enabled to succeed? And so we stop thinking about it as they have to be with the gen ed peers, as where can I serve this kid where they're going to learn to read, where they're going to learn the social skills they need, because that may not be able to occur very effectively within a general education classroom. And so there's this push for most enabling environment. So when you have a kid with a disability included in a classroom, in a general education classroom, there's some things to think of. So basically, does your kid require specific curriculum that differs from what the kids in the general education classroom receive? Well, if that's the case, maybe a separate setting is, maybe that's acceptable. Do they require some kind of specialized services that can't be conducted in the general education classroom? Who needs to be serving them? If you can push that person into a general education classroom, maybe that works, but maybe it works best, like maybe if a kid is working on speech therapy, that they do that in a separate setting, something that's not as stigmatizing and can be more direct and intensive. Okay, so take a break and come back and watch the rest of the videos.